As one of the few education models around the world offering a bespoke learning experience for primary-age children, camp education is a service that remains unique to the Falkland Islands. In its 126 years, the service has transformed from delivering a largely insular learning experience, once relying upon travelling teachers on horseback, to one that now champions interconnectivity and the use of modern technology for interactive learning. But in recent years, camp education has been fraught with challenges, and without a written policy underpinning a clear delivery model, there have been questions raised around unequal educational standards. As a result, in 2021, the Falkland Islands Government started work on an education plan with the view of clarifying the delivery model and tackling issues relating to perceived inequality among service users.
So the Camp Education Review, I think, was driven out of a necessity to have some formal policy in place. Certainly there seemed to be a gap between kind of family expectations and even different regions of camp getting kind of disparate treatment. And I think as families started talking to each other, they kind of realised, well, actually, what is the policy? What is the future and direction of camp education? And that was kind of the main motivator for getting this review progressed.
In January 2022, an external education consultant was hired by the government to provide independent data analysis as part of the review process. The consultant analysed information gathered from various stakeholder meetings, surveys and public meetings which involved the contribution of camp education service users. As a result, the review found that while there is a high quality of teaching provided through camp education, including the use of remote telephone teaching for pupils, there was some room for improvement. For example, the review mentioned that while most classrooms and accommodation in camp met certain core standards, there was a lack of clarity about what the standards should be, which led to an element of inconsistency and unfairness. Similarly, a lack of understanding about the allocation of teachers was a cause of concern among some families, with feelings of inequity strongly felt by some. Additionally, when meeting costs for the provision of classrooms and teacher accommodation, it was highlighted that there was a high degree of inconsistency in what sort of buildings were provided, by whom, and how the costs would be met. Meaning that while FIG would usually pay for the buildings to be maintained, in some cases, settlements and farms had to pay for building work themselves due to inconsistent practices. And lastly, there was a lack of understanding about the specific eligibility criteria for Stanley House, whose purpose is to enable the children of families living in camp to attend secondary education in Stanley by means of boarding.
Commenting on the apparent disparity within the service, a parent who wanted to remain anonymous said,
"There have been times when parents of the children attending the schools have had to do maintenance on the buildings or fitting outside equipment for school users. In Stanley, they have a janitor who deals with anything broken or needing maintenance, whereas here in camp, it has been left to the parents of the children to deal with. There needs to be a clear system in place to say who needs to fix and maintain the equipment and buildings."
Some of the bigger issues are more, I think, around teacher accommodation and schoolroom provision, and those, quite big issues. So some very small farms or single family farms will perhaps not have a building available that can be developed easily as a schoolroom. So that's where there are differences. And over the years, camp education have tried to help out, by providing resources or whatever might be felt was needed. But that's always been on a sort of ad hoc basis, and just as issues came up. So that's where it can seem that perhaps one family are getting more or another are getting less.
As a result of the findings, a paper containing a list of finalised recommendations for the camp education service going forward was sent to the Executive Council and approved in late August of this year. Some of the recommendations put forward propose that every child in camp get an equal amount of in-person teaching time with a travelling teacher, that there be an adoption of proposed standards for classrooms and teacher accommodation in camp, as well as there being a set of proposed principles under which FIG would be required to cover maintenance costs, Other recommendations propose that while the eligibility criteria for Stanley House should remain flexible, it would seek to only allow the admission of pupils who live further than 30 minutes from Stanley. And while the changes were welcomed by some, others felt that the lack of consultation in the final stage of the review was a missed opportunity.
It was really important that we built trust and communication, and that was kind of echoed throughout the stakeholder meetings, which I think actually got to a really good place. And I think it was disappointing to not have the final recommendations go through that group before they came to EXCO. I think it was a missed opportunity, but hopefully people will still sign up to the outcomes and the implementation of this.
Writing an EXCO policy is a role for a paid government worker. I mean, it's an officer's job, and it's the director's responsibility to ensure that EXCO papers are fit for purpose. Everything that is written in the EXCO paper reflects the views of stakeholders, it reflects the workshops that we've had. There are no surprises. I think what it will give camp families is certainty. So there'll be real clarity about what service they're entitled to. And that's something that I think families really sought.
The ultimate aim of the CAM Education Review was to facilitate development and improvement of the service. And while that goal has been achieved in part, there remains concern about what the implementation of these new changes could mean for families in the future.